The classroom is tense. You could hear a pin drop. The teacher's voice cuts through the silence, sharp and unforgiving. Her finger jabs the air toward the back row. You think rules don't apply to you, she snaps. A quiet black girl with a limp sits still, eyes lowered. Her notebook remains open, untouched. She doesn't argue. Doesn't explain. Doesn't defend herself. The class stares. Some in shock. Some in guilt. No one speaks. The teacher scoffs, arms crossed, convinced she's put the girl in her place. But what she doesn't realize is this. That moment will be the last time she feels in control. The first Monday of the semester always carried a strange mix of nerves and excitement at Bell Ridge High. This year, however, there was something else in the air, tension. A new principal had been appointed over the summer, and although her name was printed in staff emails and spoken over the intercom, no student had actually seen her in person. Rumors filled the hallways. Some said she was strict, others whispered she was sent from the district to clean house. But for now, she remained a mystery. Inside room B12, however, mystery had no place. Order ruled. Mrs. Karen Dalton, a veteran teacher with nearly 20 years under her belt, stood at the front of the class like a general before her troops. Her posture was rigid, her cardigan perfectly buttoned, and her heels clicked sharply against the linoleum whenever she moved. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her eyes alone could freeze a student mid-sentence. At exactly 8:02 a.m., the classroom door creaked open. Heads turned. A girl stood in the doorway, quiet and still, holding a piece of paper in one hand and a backpack strap in the other. Her skin was deep brown, her eyes downcast. Her walk was uneven, one leg moved stiffly, supported by a visible brace. Each step she took was slow, deliberate, but proud in its own way. She didn't limp with shame. She limped because that was how she moved. Her name, though no one knew it yet, was Amara. Mrs. Dalton didn't smile. She barely blinked. She glanced at her silver wristwatch, then looked up with a face carved from cold stone. Late on day one. Her voice was dry, firm, with the faintest edge of sarcasm. The room fell into silence. Amara paused, swallowing. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said quietly, her voice almost fragile, but without fear. Dalton said nothing else. She simply turned back to the whiteboard, picked up a marker, and began writing. Amara took this as permission. She made her way to the back of the class, the squeak of her brace barely louder than the ticking wall clock. As she passed row after row of students, some of them watched her openly. One boy elbowed his friend and nodded toward her leg. A girl near the window whispered something and snorted. Another student leaned forward, openly smirking. No one spoke to her. No one welcomed her. Her presence had made them uncomfortable, and in high school, discomfort often dressed itself as mockery. Amara reached her seat, pulled out a notebook, and sat down without a word. Her shoulders were straight. Her eyes stayed forward. She didn't look at the ones who left. She didn't need to. Her silence said enough. Mrs. Dalton's roll call had a rhythm to it, practiced and precise. Her voice moved down the list like a sharp pencil drawing lines, clipped and steady, no pause, no warmth. Each name was a checkpoint, each response a confirmation of order. She prided herself on control, and the classroom followed her pace. Then her eyes narrowed at an unfamiliar name near the bottom of the page. She hesitated. The silence, though brief, made the students look up. Her brow furrowed slightly, lips pursed in concentration. Amara, she said, dragging out the syllables as if tasting something foreign and unpleasant on her tongue. Heads turned in unison. All eyes found Amara. She lifted her hand a little, not high, just enough to be noticed. Her voice was soft, careful, but confident in its own quiet way. "It's Amara," she said gently, placing the stress exactly where it belonged. Her eyes didn't challenge, they explained. Mrs. Dalton didn't acknowledge the correction. She blinked once, then looked down at her clipboard, red pen tapping with finality. "Unusual name," she murmured flatly, writing something that Amara couldn't see but certainly felt. The way Dalton said it wasn't curiosity, it was judgment. Around the room, a few students chuckled. One boy with messy hair leaned over to whisper something that made his friend snort. A girl with pink nails pretended to cough, hiding her grin behind her hand. The laughter was quick, quiet, but sharp, just enough to sting, just enough to remind Amara she didn't belong. Dalton didn't stop them. She didn't glance up. Instead, she looked back at Amara, her eyes scanning her clothes like a scanner for flaws. Hoodie. Plain black. A little oversized. Jeans. Clean but faded. Shoes that had clearly walked more than a few hard miles. The dress code, Dalton said, her voice clipped like a warning bell, isn't optional. She didn't say what rule had been broken. She didn't need to. The words weren't about the clothes. They were about control. About letting Amara know she was being watched. Amara didn't flinch. She lowered her hand, adjusted the cuff of her sleeve, then rested both arms on the desk. Her face remained neutral, her shoulders still. She didn't respond, didn't defend herself, didn't shrink or glare. Her calm was unnerving, not the silence of fear, but the silence of someone who's learned how to endure. Across the aisle, a voice whispered just loud enough to be heard, "She's weird." Dalton kept reading names. No reaction. No discipline. No protection. But the moment had already sealed itself. The air in the room had shifted. No one said it out loud, but the message was clear. Amara was different. Not because of her name. Not because of her limp. But because she didn't apologize for either. In that classroom, different didn't go unnoticed. It didn't go unpunished. The line had been drawn. And Amara was already on the outside. Class was settling into its rhythm. Pages turned, chairs shifted, and Mrs. Dalton moved briskly across the front of the room, a box of textbooks cradled in her arms. She moved with purpose, calling out names one by one as she placed a copy on each student's desk, her heels clicking softly against the floor. But when she reached the last desk in the second row, the pattern broke. She didn't call the name. She didn't even glance in that direction. She simply turned, returned to the front, and placed the empty box beside her desk. Amara sat there, hands folded, eyes forward. No book. No explanation. Just silence. She waited a few seconds. Then she raised her hand. Not high, not urgent. Just enough to signal she wasn't confused, just left out. "Mrs. Dalton," she said quietly, "I didn't receive a book." The room paused. A few heads turned, mostly out of habit, some out of curiosity. Dalton didn't even look up. Her voice came cold and sharp. "If you'd arrived on time, you'd have won." The words didn't sting because they were loud. They stung because of how easy they came. As if being late had erased her right to ask. As if her presence was already too much. Amara lowered her hand slowly, her face unreadable. In the third row, Layla glanced over. She hesitated, then gently pushed her book toward the edge of her desk. "We can share," she whispered, barely audible. It was an act of quiet kindness. The sort that doesn't seek praise. The kind that notices what others ignore. But before Amara could accept, the sound of a palm hitting wood broke the moment. Dalton slammed her desk. "No special treatment," she said flatly, eyes now locked on Layla. "Everyone here is expected to manage on their own." The room tensed. A few students glanced around, unsure where to look. One boy raised his eyebrows, another shifted in his seat uncomfortably. Amara didn't move. She didn't argue. Her back stayed straight, her hands rested in her lap. She turned her eyes back to the front board, as if nothing had happened. But something had. Dalton watched her for a long second. Her gaze was sharp, heavy with something more than discipline. It wasn't just about the book. It was about setting the tone, keeping control, establishing who belonged and who didn't. And in that silent exchange, she made it clear, Amara was not going to get the benefit of the doubt. Not today. Not here. The message wasn't just for Amara. It was for the whole class. And they understood. The hallway buzzed with voices and movement, lockers slamming, footsteps echoing off the tile. It was second period change, and Bell Ridge High's corridors were always chaotic, a river of teenagers pouring from one class to the next. In the middle of that flow, Amara walked alone, her limp more noticeable now that she wasn't sitting behind a desk. Her steps were steady but uneven, left foot forward, then a slight pause. Her brace shifted beneath her jeans. She moved slowly, not because she wanted attention, but because that was the only way her body allowed. She kept her head down, her books close to her chest. A group of boys trailed a few steps behind, loud, careless, the kind who fed off attention. One of them, tall with a crooked smile, began dragging his leg behind him, mocking Amara's limp with exaggerated steps. The others laughed. "Hey, slow motion," he called out, voice rising over the noise, "you late to lunch or just buffering?" The laughter hit like a wave, quick, shallow, and cruel. It bounced off lockers and walls. A few nearby students looked over and smirked, some pretending not to notice. Amara didn't stop. She didn't flinch. Her shoulders stayed square. Her eyes didn't wander. She just kept walking, one uneven step at a time, like she couldn't hear them, or had heard it all before. Layla had been walking behind, but now she caught up. She glanced at the boys, then at Amara, her jaw tied with quiet anger. "Why don't you say something?" she asked, not with judgment, but with disbelief. "They're jerks. You should say something." Amara kept her pace. Her voice, when it came, was calm. Almost too calm. "I'm used to it." She didn't say it like a victim. She said it like someone who had decided long ago that silence would cost her less than a fight. They reached the corner near the stairwell. A staff member stepped out from a side office, Mr. Grady, one of the assistant administrators. He glanced at the boys, still laughing a few feet back. His eyes lingered on Amara for just a moment, on her brace, on her limp, on her silence, then flicked away. He didn't say anything. He just adjusted the papers in his hand and walked in the opposite direction. Layla stopped walking for a beat, stunned. He saw them. He saw everything. Amara didn't respond. Her face remained neutral, but something in her eyes dimmed slightly. She wasn't surprised. That was the worst part. They kept walking. The hallway began to thin as students reached their classrooms. The laughter faded behind them. Layla sighed, shaking her head. "You really don't talk much, huh?" Amara turned her head slightly. There was no smile, no defensiveness, just a simple truth in her tone. "People talk enough for me." Layla didn't know how to answer that. She just kept walking beside her, quietly. And Amara, as always, walked forward without looking back, through the noise, through the glances, through the silence of people who saw everything and said nothing. The teacher's lounge buzzed with the low hum of microwaves and muted conversations. A half-empty tray of donuts sat untouched on the counter. The room was dimmer than the classrooms, filled with quiet sighs, the occasional fork tapping against plastic, and the familiar exhaustion of people who had already spoken too many words before noon. Mrs. Dalton pushed through the door with the confidence of someone who'd spent years walking into rooms expecting control. Her purse dropped onto the nearest chair, her shoes clicked across the floor, and without bothering to lower her voice, she spoke. "I swear, the kids these days," she said, heading straight for the coffee pot, "lazy little creatures who expect sympathy for breathing." She poured herself a cup, shaking her head like she was recalling something deeply offensive. The bitterness in her voice wasn't frustration. It was disdain, old and settled. At the round table near the window, Mr. Langford looked up from his laptop. His brows drew together slightly, more curious than concerned. "Which one this time?" he asked, keeping his tone light, but his eyes sharp. Dalton turned, coffee in hand. Her lips curled into a thin, amused smile. "New girl in 10B. Walks like a penguin, acts like a saint." She chuckled quietly at her own words, as if they were clever. No one else laughed. The room stilled just a little. Ms. Reyes, who'd been flipping through graded essays, stopped mid-page. Mr. Patel coughed into his sleeve and didn't look up. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of tension, filling the corners of the room. "She's got a brace," Ms. Reyes said softly. Her voice wasn't confrontational, but it was careful, controlled, like she was weighing whether to say more. Dalton shrugged, unbothered. "I know what I see," she said, waving her free hand as if brushing away the thought. "She plays the quiet card. The sweet, tragic, misunderstood type. That limp's just a prop." A few teachers exchanged glances. It was subtle, a quick look, a slight frown, a shift in posture. No one spoke up directly, but the discomfort was there, thick and awkward. "You might want to be careful," someone said from the other side of the room. The voice came from behind a newspaper. Genderless. Calm. But intentional. Dalton turned her head slowly. Her eyes narrowed, but the smirk remained. "I've been here 20 years, she said, lifting her cup. "I know how to manage my room." She took a sip, then leaned back into her chair, crossing one leg over the other with practiced ease. The warmth of the coffee did little to soften her expression. "This one," she added after a pause, "is a lesson waiting to happen." Her tone was casual, but her eyes were focused. Controlled. Triumphant. Around her, no one responded. But the silence didn't feel like agreement. It felt like a warning she hadn't noticed. Not yet. The morning began without warning. Mrs. Dalton walked in, holding a stack of papers, her heels clicking like punctuation. "Pop quiz," she said, dropping the stack onto the desk with a thud. No explanation. No prep. Just expectation. Students groaned softly. Some whispered complaints under their breath. Others flipped their notebooks open in panic. But no one dared to argue. The quiz was short, 10 questions, but dense. Literary terms, symbolism analysis, a brief paragraph requiring structured thought. It was the kind of quiz designed to catch students off guard. To reveal who'd been coasting. Most of the class looked overwhelmed. Pages turned too fast. Pencils hovered in midair. Some scratched answers with hesitation, others tapped nervously on the desk. Dalton paced slowly down the rows, arms crossed, her eyes sharp and alert. Amara sat near the back, calm, still. Her pencil moved steadily. No erasing. No hesitation. Her eyes stayed on the page. She took her time, not because she didn't know, but because she knew exactly how she wanted to answer. Her handwriting was small and clean. Her analysis was tight. Her paragraph at the end was thoughtful, almost too mature for her age. When the bell rang, most students were still scribbling. Amara stood quietly, limped forward with quiet dignity, and laid her paper on top of the stack. She didn't say a word. Then she returned to her seat, slow but composed, while the rest of the class rushed out behind her. The next morning, Dalton arrived early. She had the quizzes in hand, neatly stacked and marked in red ink. She said nothing as she walked through the aisles, slapping papers face down on desks with practiced rhythm. When she reached Amara, she paused. A beat too long. Her mouth twisted slightly, not quite a smile, more like amusement stretched too thin. She set the paper down with deliberate slowness. "Well," she said loudly enough for several students to hear, "seems a bit advanced for someone who can't even walk straight." A few heads lifted. One boy winced. No one laughed. Amara looked at the paper. AD. The red ink felt like a wound across the margin. But the answers were correct. Everyone. Her writing, precise. Her conclusions, supported. The grade didn't match the work. And that wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. She didn't blink. Didn't look up. She folded the paper once, neatly, and slipped it into her notebook. Layla leaned in. Her voice was sharp with disbelief. "That's not fair. You nailed that quiz." Dalton turned, her expression tight. "Life's not fair," she snapped. The words came fast. Defensive. Harder than they needed to be. The room went still. Chairs didn't move. Nobody breathed too loudly. Amara's face didn't change. She sat tall. Her hands stayed folded. Her eyes stared forward. She didn't push back. She didn't crumble. She let the silence settle. It wasn't defeat. It wasn't fear. It was something else, something stronger. A kind of inner stillness that didn't need applause or defense. Layla looked at her again, really looked. And for the first time, she didn't just see a girl who limped. She saw someone holding power no one could touch. The kind of strength that didn't raise its voice. Because it didn't need to. By midweek, the classroom had shifted into a different rhythm. Mrs. Dalton stood at the front, her voice brisk as she handed out instruction sheets. "Group project," she said, tapping the board with the back of her pen. "You'll work in pairs of 3. Picked by me." Students groaned softly. A few heads turned, hoping for good matches. Dalton ignored the noise and began listing names. Ryan, Melissa, and Alex. Jasmine, Theo, and Brittany. Her eyes scanned the room, then landed on Amara. "Amara, you'll work with Zach and Tyler." The room stirred. Zach and Tyler, the same boys who had mocked Amara in the hallway, who whispered and smirked behind her back. Layla turned toward Amara immediately, worry written across her face. Amara didn't react. She just nodded once and opened her notebook. Later that day, during the work session, the classroom buzzed with conversation and movement. Laughter erupted from one group. Another argued over font sizes. At Amara's table, silence reigned. She had her laptop open, notes spread beside her. Zach was texting under the desk. Tyler doodled in the margins of the instruction sheet. Amara asked questions, offered ideas, gently suggested how to structure the presentation. They ignored her. Every word floated into empty space. When she asked again, Tyler said, "You're doing great. Just keep going." Zach didn't even look up. So she did it all. She researched, she wrote, she designed the slides. She formatted the citations and rehearsed the script. Her hands moved quickly, her mind clear, her voice never rising. No complaints. No confrontation. The day of submission, Amara printed 3 copies of the report and handed them to Mrs. Dalton before class began. Her posture was calm, almost peaceful. Dalton flipped through a few pages, scanning the content. Her lips pressed together. You expect me to believe you wrote this all by yourself? Her voice was sharp, laced with disbelief. This level of structure? This language? Amara didn't blink. Her voice came soft, steady. I did. Dalton's eyes narrowed. She said nothing more, just marked something at the top of the paper with her red pen and slid it aside. Later, when the grades were returned, Amara saw a C printed neatly in the top corner. No notes. No comments. Just the grade. Layla stared at it, stunned. That's a joke. You did everything. It was perfect. She stood, marched toward the desk, and held up the report. You gave her a C? Why? She worked harder than anyone. Dalton didn't even look up from her clipboard. This doesn't concern you. Sit down. Her voice was curt, but her meaning clear. Step back, or face the same treatment. Layla hesitated. Her hands tightened around the paper. But Amara touched her arm gently. It's okay, she whispered. Her voice was low, almost too soft to hear. But there was no sadness in it. Just quiet certainty. They'll see. And something about the way she said it, calm, unshaken, unwavering, made Layla believe she was right. The piercing scream of the fire alarm shattered the calm of second period. Students jolted upright as the red lights flashed against the pale classroom walls. In room B12, chairs scraped against the floor, backpacks were slung over shoulders in haste, and voices rose in confusion. Mrs. Dalton clapped her hands once and moved to the door. Line up, single file. Let's go, she barked. Her tone was sharp, urgent, but distant. She didn't look back. The students poured into the hallway like water through a crack. Some moved quickly, half laughing at the chaos. Others were clearly startled, unsure if it was a drill. Amid the rush, Amara stood up slowly from her chair. Her brace made the motion careful, deliberate. She clutched her notebook close, then began walking toward the door. But she was already far behind. In the crowded hallway, students moved around her. They didn't push, but they didn't wait. The current of bodies parted just enough for her to pass through, her limp more pronounced now as she tried to keep pace. Behind her, Mrs. Dalton stood watching the last of the students exit. She looked directly at Amara for a moment, expression unreadable, then turned and walked out without a word. Another teacher, Mr. Cole, raised his voice from further down the corridor. Let's move, people. No stopping. Hurry up. The urgency was real now. The alarms didn't stop. Amara didn't respond. She didn't complain. She kept moving, her eyes on the exit sign at the end of the hall. Her breath was controlled, but her steps were slower than everyone else's. By the time she reached the lawn outside, the field was already lined with students in scattered groups. Teachers held clipboards, calling out names, checking boxes. Some kids were talking, others scrolling through phones. Most hadn't noticed who was missing. Until someone did. Where's Amara? A staff member asked suddenly, eyes darting from group to group. It was Ms. Carter, the new counselor. She had a list in her hands and confusion on her face. She was in B12. Is she accounted for? The teachers glanced at each other. Dalton stood stiffly beside her homeroom list. She didn't answer. Then a voice cut through the chatter. Has anyone seen Amara? A sharper voice. One that carried weight. It belonged to the principal. She was walking fast from the admin building toward the crowd, her expression tight with panic. Her blazer was unbuttoned, one hand holding her phone, the other clenched by her side. Her pace quickened as she reached the edge of the field. And then she saw her. Amara had just stepped onto the grass, moving slowly, head down, legs stiff from the strain of walking through the hallway alone. The principal stopped in her tracks for a second, then broke into a run. She didn't care who was watching. Students fell quiet as they watched the woman, the principal no one had seen up close until now, rush across the field, straight toward the girl who always walked alone. When she reached Amara, her voice cracked. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" Her hands reached for Amara's shoulders, checking her over, eyes scanning her face with pure worry. Dozens of students turned, stunned. Some whispered. A few teachers stepped back, uncertain. Amara stood still. Her breathing slowed. Her hands loosened at her sides. She looked up, her voice low, even. "I'm fine, Mom." The silence was instant. Mouths fell open. Whispers turned into wide eyes and stunned glances. Mrs. Dalton, standing near the center of the field, didn't move. Her clipboard hung loosely at her side. Her face had changed, just slightly. Enough to show she understood. And for the first time, the crowd didn't see Amara as just the girl who limped. They saw something else. Something they hadn't expected. For a long second, the field stood still. The noise from the alarm faded in the distance, replaced by something louder. Silence. It swept across the crowd like a wave, pressing down on every voice, every breath. Teachers stopped calling roll. Students stopped moving. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees that lined the schoolyard. Dalton didn't speak. Her eyes widened slowly as the moment sank in. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. She stood frozen, fingers tightening around her clipboard. She looked at Amara, then at the principal, as if trying to make sense of what she had just witnessed. Around them, the whispers began. "Did she just say Mom?" a girl near the front asked, eyes wide. "No way," someone replied, voice hushed. "That's the principal's daughter." Another voice followed, more urgent. Why didn't anyone know? The questions spread fast. Confusion turned into realization. Students stared. Some with curiosity. Others with guilt. At the center of it all, the principal wrapped her arms around Amara. Her hold was firm, protective, but gentle. She leaned down slightly, her voice soft but clear. "I was so worried," she said, her hand brushing the side of Amara's face. Her body shielded her daughter instinctively, even in front of 100 people. Amara didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her face rested briefly against her mother's shoulder. Just for a moment. Then she pulled back and stood on her own, calm, quiet. The principal turned toward the staff without letting go of Amara's hand. "Why," she asked, her voice sharper now, "wasn't anyone assisting her?" Her tone wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It cut through the crowd. The authority in it was unmistakable. Not angry. Not hysterical. Just deeply disappointed. And that disappointment hung heavier than any shout. Several teachers looked away. Some adjusted their clipboards or stared at their shoes. A few students turned their heads, uncomfortable. No one answered. Dalton opened her mouth, as if on reflex. She started. Her voice cracked. She tried again, "I didn't realize," but her words faded. Her tongue stumbled over the rest. Her hands gripped the edge of her clipboard, knuckles pale. The principal's eyes found her. Cold. Direct. Not cruel, but unblinking. "We'll talk," she said, pausing just enough before finishing, "privately." Dalton blinked. She swallowed hard. Her gaze dropped. The crowd didn't speak. They didn't need to. The truth had already settled between them, silent but undeniable. And for the first time since the year began, the power in that space had shifted. Not with noise. Not with anger. Just with presence. The air in the auditorium was heavy with anticipation. Word of what had happened the day before had spread through every hallway, whispered across lunch tables, and passed from locker to locker like static. No one knew exactly what would be said. But everyone knew something was coming. Students filed into rows, quieter than usual. Some glanced at their phones, others leaned close to whisper. Teachers stood along the sides with folded arms and unreadable expressions. At the center of the stage, a single microphone waited. When the principal stepped forward, the chatter faded into stillness. She wore black slacks and a pale blue blouse, simple but sharp. Her posture was steady. Her gaze was even. She didn't open with a greeting. She didn't ask for silence. She simply began to speak. Inclusion, she said slowly, is not just about policies. It's not about decorations on the wall during Black History Month. It's not about smiling at someone once in a while. Her voice wasn't loud, but it filled the room. It's about how you treat people when no one is watching. It's about what you do when someone doesn't look like you, doesn't move like you, doesn't speak like you. Students shifted in their seats. Some leaned forward. A few lowered their eyes. She paused, then said it. Some of you failed a silent test. One you didn't even know you were taking. The reaction was instant. A soft wave of murmurs spread through the auditorium. Students whispered across rows, wondering who she meant, even if they already knew. But she didn't stop. I watched this school very closely, she said, her voice steady. I watched a girl walk into a new environment with grace, with strength, and with silence. And I watched how silence made her a target. Not her limp. Not her clothes. Her quiet. She took a breath and let it settle. Leadership is not how loud you are. It's what you do with your attention. Do you use it to uplift, or to humiliate? Do you notice someone left behind and say nothing, or do you act? She turned slightly, her gaze falling to the front row. Amara sat there. Still. Grounded. Her shoulders back. Her head high. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She didn't need to do either. Her presence spoke for itself. Composed. Clear. Unmoved. The principal faced the crowd again. Respect is not something you offer only to those in charge. It belongs to everyone. And power, she said, slowing her words, doesn't always come with a title. But sometimes it does. A beat of silence followed. And when it does, I promise you, it will be used. In the back row, Mrs. Dalton shifted. Her hand brushed her skirt, adjusting it for no reason. She looked straight ahead, but her eyes blinked more than usual. Her jaw clenched, then released. One knee bounced once, then stopped. She was still trying to look unaffected. But she wasn't. The weight in the room had shifted. It was no longer about position. It was about truth. And no one could look away from it anymore. The principal let her last sentence hang in the air. The room was hushed, but not tense. There was something different now. A quiet recognition. A shift in balance that had been building all week. She stepped back slightly from the microphone, took a slow breath, then returned with calm precision. I want to make something clear, she said, her voice lower, more deliberate. There will be a full review of faculty conduct. The words came not as a threat, but as a decision already made. She didn't pause for reaction. She didn't soften the message. Every complaint will be heard, she continued. Every voice will matter. She looked at the students now. She let the words settle into their shoulders. Some sat taller. Others leaned forward. Then she turned her gaze to the faculty. Her head didn't move quickly, but her eyes scanned the teachers standing at the sides of the auditorium. Most avoided her gaze. A few nodded faintly. And then she looked directly at Mrs. Dalton. Their eyes locked. Dalton sat rigid, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face had been set in a neutral expression since the beginning of the assembly. But now, something flickered. A hint of color drained from her cheeks. Her fingers twitched slightly. Her lips parted, then pressed back together. The principal didn't flinch. "This school," she said, eyes still on Dalton, "will not tolerate discrimination. Not the obvious kind. Not the whispered kind. Not the kind we pretend doesn't matter just because it doesn't make noise." Her voice didn't rise. She didn't name names. But the message couldn't have been clearer. Passive or direct, she added, and this time her tone cut through the silence like glass. There was no outburst from the students. No loud applause. But something more honest happened. A ripple of quiet cheers. A few claps. A breath of air that felt like justice beginning to move. It wasn't celebration. It was release. In the front row, Amara sat motionless. Her eyes stared forward. Her hands were still folded. Her face showed no triumph. No anger. No vindication. Only calm. There was nothing loud about her presence, but it anchored the space. Everyone saw her now, but she wasn't performing for any of them. She was just there. Exactly as she'd always been. Still. Strong. Whole. Beside her, Layla shifted slightly in her seat. Without a word, she reached out and took Amara's hand. Her fingers were warm, firm, reassuring. It wasn't for attention. It was quiet loyalty. Quiet care. Amara's fingers closed around hers. Gently. Then she turned her head just a little. And for the first time that week, her mouth curved into a soft smile. It wasn't wide. It didn't demand to be seen. But it was real. It was full. And it was enough. The morning announcements came as they always did. A slight crackle from the overhead speaker. A pause. Then the familiar voice of the assistant principal filled the classroom, flat but clear. "This is a reminder," he said, "that Mrs. Dalton has been placed on temporary leave pending internal review. A substitute will be present until further notice." The room shifted. Some students straightened in their seats. Others looked around, exchanging glances that ranged from surprise to quiet satisfaction. There were no gasps. No loud reactions. Just murmurs beneath breath. A ripple of energy that pulsed through the classroom like a silent exhale. Someone whispered, "Wow, they really did it." Another muttered, "About time." The substitute teacher, a gentle woman in her 30s with soft eyes and a calming voice, stood near the whiteboard organizing folders. She didn't comment on the news. She simply moved forward with quiet purpose, her tone light and steady. A few moments later, the door opened. Amara stepped in. Same backpack. Same brace. Same quiet limp. But something felt different. She didn't walk faster. She didn't walk taller. But the way the room received her had changed. No one laughed. No one smirked. No one looked away. Instead, as she moved down the aisle, students shifted. They made space for her without a word. A small parting, subtle but unmistakable. A hallway of respect where none had existed before. She didn't speak. She didn't thank them. She didn't need to. The substitute looked up and smiled. "Good morning, Amara. I'm glad you're here." Her voice was warm. Honest. No pity. No performance. Amara nodded, her lips pressed gently together. "Morning." She made her way to her seat, pulled out her notebook, and sat down like it was just another day. But it wasn't. The air was different now. It saw her. Not because of the principal. Not because of what was said. But because the silence that once tried to erase her had lost its hold. Layla leaned over. Her voice was barely a whisper, but full of quiet joy. "They see you now." Amara glanced sideways. Her eyes didn't shine with victory. Just understanding. She looked forward again. "They always could," she said softly. "They just chose not to." Her words weren't bitter. They were true. And that truth settled into the room with more weight than any announcement. Sometimes the loudest voices in the room are not the ones speaking. Sometimes the most powerful person isn't the one standing at the front, but the one sitting quietly, refusing to be erased. Amara never shouted. She never fought back with anger. But every day, she showed up. She moved forward. And in her silence, she carried something stronger than defiance. She carried dignity. What does it say about us, when we choose to ignore someone just because they do not demand our attention? When we see difference as weakness, and strength only in volume? This story reminds us that real leadership is not always about being seen first. It's about how we treat those we think no one sees. That kindness, respect, and inclusion are not grand gestures. They are small choices, made quietly, again and again. And maybe the most important truth is this. People like Amara don't need to be given a voice. They already have one. What they need is space. What they need is for us to listen. If this story moved you, even just a little, share it. Leave a comment. Tell us what strength means to you. And if you believe quiet voices deserve to be heard, subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes, the most powerful change begins in silence.